All the doors in my house have been removed from the hinges, not counting the entrance because that one is safe. I carry a doorstop with me at all times. When people ask me why I can't be around closed doors, I tell them it's crippling fear from an unprocessed trauma. In a sense, I'm not lying, but it's far from the truth. We carry so many heavy things on our conscience that it becomes a part of our persona. Life without that burden is impossible to imagine, but there comes a point in life when we have to drop the dead weight. Some people are lucky enough to do it early. Those people get to experience life to the fullest without that looming dark cloud. Others, like me, hold on to their shackles because there's beauty in the pain, because without it, we would be stripped of everything familiar, and we wouldn't even know who we are anymore. I hope what I'm about to share will bring me a semblance of a closure I've been seeking all these years. 20 years earlier, my dad got a job offer that forced our family to move to Woodbury, Oregon. For a teenager accustomed to the vibrant city life of Portland, this was a jarring shift. I was too young and too absorbed in my own world in order to appreciate the vast expanse of firs and pines cascading over the roiling hills, the tranquility nature's embrace offered, and the warmth and camaraderie of small communities. I still remember how hot that May morning was when we arrived in front of our new home. I recall my parents marveling at the house, talking about life in the town with optimism. Some neighbors had come by to introduce themselves to my parents. Just like every bitter teen, I entered the house and climbed upstairs into what I hoped would become my room once we settled. For the next 15 minutes, the reality of my new life was starting to dawn on me with a crushing weight. With no proper way to keep in touch, it wouldn't be long before my friends forget about me. That's life, I guess. When we're young, every upheaval feels like the end of the world. If only we knew back then how easy we had it. Friendships blossomed from shared glances, cool toys, or the coincidence of being in the same place. As we grow older, those friendships transform into something with layers of depth. It's no longer just about having fun in the moment. It's about existential crises and finding answers to life's big questions. That is where paths often diverge. At that crossroads where the broad meets the specific, we often come to a realization that it's not always a falling out that ends friendships. More often than not, it's the steady march of life pulling us apart. Sometimes people change, and so on. That brings me back to Woodbury. My contemplation was interrupted when my mom called me downstairs to meet the new neighbors. Grouching, I stamped to the front door, expecting an elderly woman carrying a tray of mint cookies or a married couple from across the street flashing taut grins. Instead, I was met with a boy and a girl my age, an unexpected surprise. "Hi," the girl said. "I'm Nicole." She was a pretty thing, big, ocean-colored eyes. That was the first thing I noticed about her, short and with ginger hair tied into a ponytail. The way she incessantly stared at me in fascination suggested that new faces in the neighborhood were a novelty. The lanky boy next to her might have shared in her enthusiasm, but the long bangs partially covering his face made it difficult to tell. His back slouched, perhaps to reach the pockets of the sagging pants his hands were buried into, and when he spoke up, he did so with a deep and resonant voice that belied his slender frame. "Hey, James, we live nearby." He hooked a thumb in a general direction down the street. For a moment, he straightened his back and squared his shoulders, as if following an echo of a reminder, perhaps an adult reprimanding him for his improper posture. "Hi." That was all I could manage. I didn't like those pairs of eyes plastered to me. I felt like an animal at the zoo, there for entertainment of these two visitors. My mom must have sensed my hesitation, because she put a hand on my shoulder and did the introduction for me. "This is Chris. We just moved here from Portland," she said. Heat rushed into my face. I felt embarrassed in front of the two people that could potentially become my new and possibly only friends in Woodbury, and my tongue refused to cooperate. "Cool," James said. "Nice to meet you." Nicole smiled. When she did so, she revealed a row of crooked teeth, crooked in a cute way. Even with my dad talking to the neighbor that awfully resembled a typical suburban dad as the background noise, The silence that stretched between me, Nicole, and James was awkward. Eventually, it was Nicole who broke the silence. We were going to go down this trail just outside the neighborhood. There's a cool hangout spot. Want to come? My initial instinct was to look at my mom for approval, but I resisted it because I didn't want to score any extra negative points in the first impression. Sure. Fuck it. Let's do it, I said in a rare display of profanity in front of her. I then looked at her. The round of chiding I expected for the cussing didn't come, but I could see her lips tightening into an ephemeral grimace, just enough to tell me, "You're lucky your friends are here." "Be home by dinner," she said instead. James pulled his hands out of his pockets and led the way. He took long, stork-like steps, dragging his already dirty pant legs across the ground. I remember thinking how my mom never would have allowed me to ruin a pair of pants like that just for the sake of looking cool. But I also envied James for that apparent freedom. For the first few minutes of walking, we didn't speak, and the air was tense with that silence, as if all three of us were thinking of how to start a conversation without being too corny about it. "So, what's life like here?" By the time I realized how stupid that question sounded, the words had already left my mouth. "Boring," Nicole said. "It has its perks," James said. "I thought everybody wanted to leave the small town eventually." I raised an eyebrow. "Move somewhere bigger." "Everyone normal," Nicole said. "I can't wait to graduate and leave this shithole." "Where do you plan to go?" I asked. "I don't know. Somewhere big. A place where nobody would know me, where I could make a fool of myself in a crowded place and not worry about the whole town knowing about it for the rest of my life." It sounded as if Nicole was speaking from experience, either hers or someone else's. "Oh, come on. Woodbury is not like that," James said. Nicole gave him a look. "Miss Coates is still known as the Cat Lady." "So?" "She's been dead for 20 years. It's a pretty distinct title." "Well, it wouldn't be in a big city. Over there, you could do whatever you want and be whatever you want, and no one would even look in your direction. And you know why? Because people don't care over there. They have their own busy lives, and there are far too many cat ladies for them to pay attention. Right, Chris?" She spun, waiting for me to chime in. I couldn't really tell, because Nicole was giving me perspective on something I had known all my life. To someone who believed since early childhood the sky was blue, anything opposite seemed outlandish. I had grown up in a city, and that made me desensitized to the benefits of privacy and opportunity it offered. "Living in a small town has its perks," James repeated. "Oh yeah? Name some," Nicole insisted. "There's safety in it. You know everybody and everybody knows you. You know you can count on your neighbors. It's a real community, not a traffic-jammed rat maze packed with people who are dead inside slaving away from morning to dusk for their corporate overlords." "Would you rather work at the local movie theater for the rest of your life?" Nicole asked. "I'd rather trade the extra money for some peace and quiet. I mean, listen." He stopped and raised a finger. Nicole and I stopped abruptly, too. "You hear that?" Gentle swaying of trees in the wind. In the distance, the migration of a car's engine. An occasional chirp from the canopies. I had never lived in a neighborhood as serene as this one. Police and ambulance sirens were my lullabies and white noise. This silence was unnerving. It carried too much emptiness, too much room for pondering. I assumed that the abyssal vacuum would only amplify with the arrival of night, especially in the quiet hours while trying to sleep. That was when the body relaxed and the mind went to work, filling the blanks with a compilation of all the embarrassing moments that made us question our competence as a human being. "It's too quiet. How do people even fall asleep when it's like this?" I asked. "You'll get used to it after a while," James said. If it meant I would be lulled into this monotony of a life, then I didn't want to get used to it. We continued walking to the edge of the woods, presumably marking the border of the neighborhood. I looked back toward my new house. I could still see my dad in front, but as a distant, imperceptible figure. "You coming?" James asked. I turned my head toward them to see them standing at the beginning of the trail. "Where are we going?" I asked. It's a cool hangout spot. You'll see, Nicole said. She must have noticed my reluctance because she said, "We'll get you home before dinner. Promise." Another pang of embarrassment, which I promptly suppressed. I had already made a decision that I wanted to be a part of James and Nicole's gang, and for that to happen, I had to be cool, not lame. The trail meandered between encroaching trees, their dense foliage forming a natural parasol above us. Dry branches cracked under our shoes, the echo sharp and satisfying in the stillness of the air. Occasionally, something small skittered through the underbrush. It was an entirely different world here. Quiet, but not in the same way. The farther we treaded, the more apparent that became, because this wasn't a typical trail used for hiking. There were no signs of frequent activities here, just the thin, battered path we followed in line between the weaving trees. This forest belonged to the teens, not the adults. It was our domain, sanctuary away from prying eyes where we were the rulers. I said we because I already felt like I was a part of the inner sanctum Nicole and James had formed. At some point, James stopped. He pointed off the trail to his left and said, "This way." "Where are we going?" I asked again, a flicker of uncertainty urging me to go back. "It's cooler if we show you," Nicole said. She gestured to the rock sitting in the grass. "This is the first landmark. Remember it." She was talking like I would be coming here more often. In that moment, I knew I would. If not for the repose this place offered, then for Nicole. If those blue eyes weren't enough to convince me, then the smile was. Never underestimate a teenager's hormones. We trekked through the tall stalks of grass for a few minutes until we reached a clearing. In the midst of the ground stood an opening descending into inky blackness. "What's that?" I asked. James was already descending the ladder attached to the hole. Nicole gave me a reassuring look. "It'll be worth it. Trust me." She went down next. Left alone in the open sky, I approached the aperture and peered down. I could just vaguely make out two silhouettes shifting in the darkness. "Come on," James's voice came out as tinny. I put my foot on the first rung. The ladder squealed in protest. The whole thing was rusted, jangled with each step I took, the reek of an imminent injury, or worse, looming right above me, gnawing at the nape of my neck. Pretty soon, I was plunged into darkness. All I had as orientation was the daylight that poured in from above. Daring to look down, thick darkness seemed to congeal at my feet. "You're almost here," Nicole said, her voice sounding both close and far at the same time. It was the boost I needed. Somehow my eyes adjusted to the dark by the time I reached the bottom. When my feet touched the slick surface of the ground, I said a silent prayer for not slipping and breaking my ankle. Nicole was staring at me with a complacent smile. James, on the other hand, was fiddling with something by a wall I couldn't see. Moments later, a spear of light cut through the darkness. He swept the flashlight directly across my eyes, momentarily blinding me. "This way," he said, bounding down the tunnel, which I hadn't seen was there until then. "Wow," I said. My voice sounded amplified in the enclosed space. Giving the familiar daylight above me one final glance, I went after my companions through the tunnel. My shoes splashed across the shallow puddles. Twice I held out a hand for support on the nearby wall, only to have my fingers come off slick with grime. My trepidation was kept in check by my fascination with this place. How often does a teen get to explore a tunnel? "Does anyone else know about place?" I asked. "Nope, just me and Nicole," James said from the front. "I'm amazed no one has discovered this yet." Both Nicole and James became just an octave quiet, and it was then that I knew I had said something I shouldn't have. Nicole craned her neck toward me. "We had a friend. He's the one who discovered this place." "What happened to him?" I asked, even though I knew I shouldn't have. A moment of pause lingered between us, as if Nicole and James were trying to decide who should be the one to tell me. "He left Woodbury," James said. "I think his parents got a new job or something." There was resentment in his voice, maybe even anger toward that unnamed friend. Nicole's demeanor, on the other hand, betrayed, Was it hurt? Didn't he tell you why he needed to leave? I asked. It all happened in a hurry, Nicole said. Hey, it doesn't matter. Andrew's gone, but we're still here, James said. But the pitch of his voice was just a little too high. We must have been walking for 20 minutes before we reached another ladder. This one ascended into blackness. James climbed first. Nicole and I watched the cone of his flashlight bobbing farther and farther up. When he was at the top, a loud metallic groan shrieked through the air. Then James pointed his light down and said, Okay. You want to go first? Nicole asked. I nodded. This ladder was firmer in place, albeit equally rusty, and with a missing rung that James had warned me about just before I missed the invisible step. When I reached the top, he helped hoist me up. He harbored a lot of strength for someone as bony. Thanks, I said. Nicole joined in seconds later. I took in my surroundings. The first thing I became too aware of was the sour smell that came with old places. Swaths of old, faded wallpaper peeled to reveal plaster. Cobweb clung to the corners of the ceiling. Wherever sunlight peered through the cracks, dust gyrated in erratic manner. Where are we? I asked. It's an abandoned house, James said. He bent down and closed the hatch. The hinges produced another ancient caterwaul before the lid slammed shut. James turned off the flashlight. Despite the boarded-up windows, there was sufficient light to navigate the house without a torch. Come on, we'll give you a tour around the place, Nicole said. The rest of the house was in an equally ramshackle state. Heavy patinas of dust clung to furniture, tables, banisters, shelves, and other surfaces, a testament of their abandonment. In places, the wood flooring had risen, sloping bumps slanting and toppling furniture. Doors were left ajar, perpetually stuck by the floor that stopped them from moving. On the lower floor, a living room sprawled in grandeur, its walls adorned with framed pictures of nature. A broken TV sat like a forgotten relic, an antique coffee table in front of it, marred by time. The kitchen floor, once pristine linoleum, now betrayed its age with the edges that curled like corners of an old map. James and Nicole led me upstairs. The trail of swept dust showed which parts of the house they used frequently. We just briefly peered into an office where a formidable oak desk dominated with its presence. Behind it, the shelves stacked with tattered books whistled their neglect. The bedroom revealed a concave floor. We were about to turn into a room on the left when I noticed a closed door at the end of the corridor. It was the obtrusive manner in which it stood that caught my attention. A simple, sturdy door beckoning me to come closer, twist the knob, and discover the secrets within. Hey, what's over there? I asked. Oh. Nicole gave it an aloof glance. We'll get to that later. Come on. I couldn't pry my gaze away from that door. A gravitational force pulled my consciousness toward it, strumming the strings of curiosity in my head. The corners of my vision narrowed, hyper-focusing on that door. And somehow, I felt myself drawing nearer to it, so near that I could see the round knob. I could feel the cold of it in my hand, could sense the resistance it offered as I twisted. Chris! James's voice snapped my attention back to the real world. I was still rooted to the spot where I had stood, next to the empty room. Ignoring the closed door at the end of the corridor, we entered the empty room, but at a vaguely conscious level, I could hear the door calling to me. Bottles and cans of beer, crushed cigarette packs, and candy wrappers littered the floor. I approached the window and peered outside. Tall grass surrounded the house. From what I could tell from the other windows, there was no good way to approach the property. That, coupled with the fact that the house was in the middle of the woods, made for a perfect refuge for rebellious teens. Okay, not gonna lie, this is pretty cool, I said. Right? Nicole asked. We often come here to chill out after school, James said. Whose house is this? James shrugged. Who the fuck knows? It's been here longer than we have. I spun to scan the room. A Polaroid was tacked to the wall. Curious, I inspected it. A young man with a stuck-out tongue held one arm around Nicole, the other around James, who presumably held the camera to take a picture of them. Nicole was laughing. drawn close by the man's embrace. "Is that him?" I asked. "Yeah." There was a hint of somberness in Nicole's voice. "That's Andrew." The fingers of the hand which he had around Nicole were adorned with garish rings. I noted a skull on his ring finger. The rest were indiscernible. It was a timeless moment that would never repeat. 3 friends, oblivious to the past or the future, just living in the moment for that rush of dopamine that each other's presence gave them. Looking at the picture made me sad on Nicole and James's behalf. There were still too many unspoken things about Andrew, things they weren't ready to share. The despondency that had suddenly appeared in the air alluded to that. "So, the house. You said no one else knows about it?" I asked. Nicole shook her head. "Nope. And speaking of that, now that you do know about it, it means you're part of our gang, whether you like it or not." Before the warmth of welcoming could snuggle up to my chest properly, James said, "And being a part of our gang means you need to follow a few strict rules." They were both staring at me, waiting for my approval so they could recite the terms and conditions. I nodded once. "Rule number 1, you never tell anyone about this place. Never," James said. "You can come here all you like with us or alone, but you never ever show it to anyone." "Why?" "Because the word's going to spread, and that means the entire house is going to become like this room." He gestured to the trash. "Fair enough," I said. "That brings me to rule 2, James said. "This is the hangout room. No trash in the rest of the house. Got it?" Another nod. "Okay. And rule number 3. He paused, probed me with his gaze. My eyes flitted from James to Nicole. They both had the most grievous looks on their faces. "What?" I asked. "We don't ever open that door," James said. The flat tone made me think they were playing with me. I let out a chuckle, but it was dry, unconvincing. They didn't laugh. "You're serious?" I asked. "Yes," Nicole said, confirming James's rule. "We don't ever open that door." "Why?" "We just don't." "What's behind it?" "We don't know. It's been closed ever since Andrew found it. He's the one who made the rule. We're just following the original laws." I scratched my head. "Don't you think he might have been messing with you?" I tried to evoke laughter out of them. It didn't work, because there was nothing humorous about this situation, apparently. "We're serious, Chris," Nicole, who had been amicable this entire time, said, confirming that this was indeed serious. "That's the most important rule. We can tolerate breaking rules 1 and 2 in some rare cases, but 3 will get you an instant ban from this place." "Permanently," James added. I didn't understand what the fuss was all about, nor did I care too much about it at that moment, because the mystery of the door was overshadowed by the excitement of finding an underground tunnel leading to an abandoned house in the middle of the forest. "Okay, deal," I said, because not opening the door was a small price to pay to be in the cool kids club. Over the next few months, I adjusted to my life in Woodbury. I started going to school, met some friends, but I mostly hung out with James and Nicole. Every day after school, we would go to the house and stay there sometimes until late evening. The house breathed a different aura with the fall of night. The exterior grew in volume, but the house itself seemed to sink into slumber. At moments, it felt wrong to speak too loudly so as to not disturb the silence that permeated the air. Other times, I felt like we could scream at the top of our lungs and no one would bother to shut us up. That unbridled freedom was refreshing for someone living under the tyranny of their parents. Only one thing remained constant and unchanged about the house. The door at the end of the hallway stood stalwart, an inanimate object that fluctuated with strange sentience in moments of utter silence. While inside the house, we would have fun, and then out of nowhere, the mood would seem to drop out of nowhere, just for a second. Always just for a second. Enough for all 3 of us to share a silent glance but never voice what that viscousness in the air meant. In those moments, my mind would inadvertently be drawn to the door with unrestrained curiosity. A nagging voice would rationalize why it was okay to open the door, that there was nothing there, that we were elevating our own temptation and giving that room more power than it had. But then that inkling would disappear just as quickly as it had arrived, and we would go back to talking and laughing. I learned a lot about my friends. James's dad wanted him to take over his car repair shop, but he wasn't interested in cars. He wanted to become a video game developer someday. People are going to work remotely in the future, he kept saying. We are all going to have computers at home, he said. Nicole and I had a lot of fun taking jabs at him for that. Once Nicole opened up, I learned that there was a lot more to her than the jovial mask she put on her face. She came from a troubled family. Her mom left when she was young, and her dad hardly paid attention to her, unless he needed her to fetch him a beer. For her, home was hell, so she sought an escape at school and at the abandoned house. The house was the only place where she could truly be herself, she said. She often mentioned Andrew. There was a sort of melancholy to her words, but also fondness. At times, she spoke about him highly, an embalmed description that couldn't possibly be true. Other times, the underlying grudge toward his disappearance became obvious. I never asked if the two of them had been more than just friends. I just sort of put two and two together. After all, people don't reveal the most about themselves through their storytelling. They reveal it between lines of seemingly innocent sentences. And sometimes, when she didn't know I was looking, she would assume this pensive gaze when she was staring at the group photo on the wall, like she was trying hard to remember something from the past, something that would shed light on a mystery that kept plaguing her mind. Or perhaps she was simply reminiscing the good times with bittersweet dejection. Either way, that scarring made her more beautiful in my eyes. It made me see past the superficial beauty, past the ossified shell she'd erected around herself, and made me appreciate her more for who she was. All our lives we're told to strive for perfection, but in truth, it's the flaws that make us beautiful. Those imperfections tell the story of our resilience in the face of adversity. Each blemish is a testament of our strength, a crack from which something beautiful can blossom. I remember it clearly. It was a cold September night when it all changed. I remember it because it was the last time I ever felt truly happy before my innocence was irrevocably stripped away. Nicole, James, and I had been chilling in the room designated for trash, just as we had been doing for the past few months. We had been drinking a little more than we planned. I wasn't drunk, but I was past the point of no return about managing to convince my parents I was sober. With that in mind, I figured I might as well go the extra mile. I don't remember what conversations we were having. That's what bothers me the most. For the past 20 years, I've been trying to recall in an attempt to regain a semblance of that innocence I had lost, but it just wasn't coming to me. People usually remembered the endings the most vividly, don't they? So why couldn't I remember? Because that wasn't the ending for me. It was only about to come. I can't remember what we had been laughing about, but what I do remember is Nicole stopping, as if a foreign thought had just occurred to her. "I miss Andrew," she said. Both James and I went quiet, because we both knew we had reached a new milestone in our friendship with Nicole. She'd never dared to voice her emotions toward Andrew up until then, to open up about the scar that obviously hadn't healed even after all this time. But the booze must have been loosening her tongue. We, as humans, don't deal well with mysteries. We need to believe there's a reason for everything in life, that God is cruel, that the universe has a plan for us, that it's fate, destiny, anything but the infinity of question marks looming millions of light years away, and yet staying in the vicinity for us to wonder. "Me too," James said, because what more was there to say? I looked down at the bottle of beer in my hand, spun it absent-mindedly. The remainder of the liquid sloshed inside. When I looked up at Nicole, her gaze was glued to the photo on the wall. She must have noticed me watching her, because she straightened her back and brushed the whole thing off with a smile. "Sorry, I didn't mean to kill the mood," she said. "No, you didn't," both James and I said, but I doubt we sounded convincing to Nicole. Nicole's eyes begged for a warm touch, a shoulder to cry on. I wanted to scoot up to her, embrace her in a tight hug, stroke her back, tell her everything was going to be okay. But I couldn't know that, could I? As I stood there weighing whether to make the bold move of comforting her, she hopped to her feet. "I'm going to use the bathroom. Be right back." The moment had passed. I could be wrong, but I thought I detected a glint in her eyes. Before I could take a better look, she bolted out of the room with stampeding footsteps. James and I sat in silence. Then, I excused myself to go to the bathroom too. I still can't remember to this day whether I had intended on going after Nicole or using the bathroom. I like to think it was the former. It's easier to deal with my cowardice that way. As I exited into the corridor, I felt that familiar burning shame that had enveloped me on the first day when I met Nicole and James. Something screamed at me to go after her, to get close to her like I wanted to, and perhaps if I had, everything in my life would have gone differently. But that voice was quickly drowned out by something that bubbled from the lowest depths of my consciousness to a boiling point. My gaze was inexplicably drawn to the door at the end of the hallway. I tried to look away, but it was a futile fight against the river currents. Maybe it was the alcohol that had sapped my willpower. Maybe I was just fed up with the curiosity. All I knew was my feet were moving on their own toward the door. Each step I took felt like sinking deeper and deeper into muck I would not be able to get out of. This was the closest I had been to the door, and the farthest to safety. I somehow knew that on an unconscious level, but my body was doing nothing to stop it. Then, I was in front of the door, staring down at the brass knob, my hand languidly hovering in front of it. Then, my fingers closed around it. Something inside of me screamed, but once again, I was powerless to stop it. And then, with a motion that felt like it lasted for an eternity, I twisted the knob, and twisted, and twisted. Behind me, I heard a scream, an effeminate no or don't, I couldn't tell. By then, the door was swinging inward. A squeak that had not been heard in perhaps decades revealed darkness beyond the threshold. A patter of footsteps ran up to me. Before I knew what was going on, firm hands clutched my shoulders, shaking me violently. I vaguely registered James yelling so loudly that spittle flew in my face. But I didn't hear anything he said. I couldn't pry my eyes away from the dark room because something in there had caught my attention. An effervescent sound that caused James to shut up. A shuffle. A moan. A moan. It was a sewage-like sound, something that would come from someone with a tube stuck down their throat. The solitary noise was joined by an orchestra of similar sounds, swelling from the darkness to a crescendo. I must have backpedaled from the door, because I suddenly realized I was standing farther away from it than James. I stared with an unblinking gaze at that roiling darkness, waiting for the source of the noise to come into light. And then it did. From the murky abyss, a hand emerged, masculine, with thick fingers and a forearm cloaked in coarse hair. It gripped the edge of the doorframe, fingers straining until the tips turned white. Then another hand, this one near the bottom, and then... My mind struggled to comprehend the abject horror unfolding in front of me. A taut wall of skin filled the doorframe, pressed against it, occupying the entire length. Countless eyes darted in every direction, never settling, ravenously exploring the space beyond their confinement. Mouths, twisted in every conceivable direction, horizontal, vertical, slanted, moved like fish out of water, uttering no words, only emitting those dreadful sounds of agony. Hands groped the air, fingers constricting and extending too stiffly, like joints that hadn't been used in a long time. The fleshy abomination couldn't fit through the door, but it was persisting nonetheless. The hands pulled its colossal form in vain. The entire time, James was standing there, staring in awe. The panic that had been inflating my chest finally unspooled, and I let out a cry at the top of my lungs. "James!" By then, it was already too late. A hand that had been seemingly flailing in the air without a purpose gripped James by the wrist. His eyes grew wide just in time when fingers groped him, tugging at his hair, his shirt, ankles. He didn't scream, even when the hands reeled him onto the flesh wall. His shoulders twitched with a futile effort to break free of their vice-like grip, but it was no use. His mouth opened, the muscles in his neck strained with a scream that was drowned out by the moans that now filled the entirety of the corridor. In a last desperate attempt, James's eyes locked with mine, a silent plea to help. Please, God, help. But even as I contemplated between the act of heroism and flight, that abhorrent thing was spilling out, shaping itself around the doorframe and the wall. I couldn't stand to look at James's expression of utter fear mixed with judgment. This was all too much for me to handle. I spun on my heel and jackknifed into a dash. I bounded down the stairs, skipping 2 at a time, almost tripping along the way. At the bottom, I bumped into Nicole, hard. "What gives?" she asked. "We gotta go." I think I managed to say that, or at least I tried to. More likely than not, the words that left my mouth were a garbled string of caveman sounds. She narrowed her eyes at me, then looked upstairs. "Where's James?" I could see the intention in her eyes. Before she took a step up, I grabbed her by the wrist. No, don't. Don't go there. We have to." A moan erupted at the top of the stairs. Too close, too fast. Nicole looked at me with a quizzical expression, then up. She jerked her hand free and ran upstairs, screaming James's name. She stopped a few steps short of reaching the upper floor, the fight drained from her. From here, I could see the shape of that thing, bloating with each pulse, devouring the space of the house. I would never know what went through Nicole's mind as she stared at those hands inching closer to her. Disbelief? Horror? By the time she broke out of her stupor, the thing was close. Far too close. Nicole screamed, spun around, but she didn't make it more than a step forward before face-planting the stairs. A hand latched onto her ankle, another on her calf. For a moment, she was dazed, but when she realized what was going on, she let out a shrill cry. It didn't matter that she clawed at the steps. It didn't matter that she cried and screamed please over and over as the flesh embraced her in a motherly hug. It didn't matter that she looked at me with the same pleading eyes as James. In the end, I was a coward. I ran. I ran into the room with the hatch. I threw it open, started down the ladder, and closed the entrance above me just in time to see the indeterminate light at the stairs blotted out, followed by a scream. This one feminine but muffled, the sound of a person gagging. A familiar sound that would haunt me for many nights in the years to come. I descended the ladder too fast and ended up slipping and falling down the last few rungs. If I hurt myself, then the adrenaline that poured into my bloodstream like liquid concrete prevented me from feeling it. I stumbled through the dark tunnel, blind, disoriented, my panting breaths echoing back. That thing was right above me. I could sense it. I couldn't see it, but it could see me. Even through the walls, I could sense those numerous eyes boring into me, following me voraciously. I didn't stop when I reached the other side of the tunnel. I didn't stop when I climbed out just in time to hear a distant, winding scream that trailed from the other end of the tunnel to me. Only when my lungs felt like they were on fire and my legs full of lead, and when the acidic bile climbed up my throat, did I reach a halt. I leaned on my knees, vomited 2 projectiles of puke, my knees threatening to buckle under my weight. By then, I could no longer sense that thing from the house. I stumbled the rest of the way home. My mom was in the living room, awake and ready to give me a round of scolding. It didn't take her long to notice something was wrong, and by then, I had broken down crying. The police were called. They didn't manage to string too much coherence out of me, just the location I pointed them to. Less than an hour later, they returned to let me know that the tunnel I was referring to had completely caved, making traversal impossible. It looked like it had been like that for a while. There was no house in the woods anywhere close to Woodbury, according to them. I was the prime suspect for a while, but with insufficient evidence to convict me, I walked free, my stories dismissed as the ravings of a deranged teenager. By then, Woodbury was clad in a veil of black. The rescue had turned into a body recovery, and then ultimately ceased entirely. The perkiness in the streets was gone. Memorials and tributes were erected all over Woodbury, the hauntingly happy faces of Nicole and James staring at me wherever I went. I became the black sheep of the town. Everyone stared at me with hateful eyes, but never actually said anything aloud. That suggestive nature was driving me crazy. Sometimes I wished they would come out and point fingers at me, punch me in the face, call me a murderer, because that's what I am. It didn't matter that I didn't deliver the killing blow. My parents weren't spared of the shunning either. Not long after that, we moved back to Portland with our tails between our legs. As far as Woodbury folks were concerned, good riddance. My parents never looked at me the same way. They tried to believe me, they really did. But the human mind can bend to adapt to the illogical only to a certain extent. If they weren't looking at me like I was a criminal, there was pity in their eyes. I don't know which I hated more. Years later, I tried various methods of therapy to get to the bottom of what happened that night, without any actual results. No one could solve my problem because no one believed me. Meds didn't help, and the glowers I earned from both experts and people I tried to make friends with helped me learn that it was better to not open up about my trauma at all. I haven't been able to look at a door the same way since then. No matter how hard I try to forget, that night follows me everywhere I go, a subtle reminder that invokes all the memories, forcing me to relive them all over again, sometimes with terrifying vividness. Lately, I've been hearing it a lot, in the quietest hours just before I drift to sleep. The tortured sound that jolts me wide awake in cold perspiration. Sometimes it's that moan. Sometimes it's an agonizingly familiar scream pushed to the forefront of the fleshy mass, a taunting gesture to remind me of my cowardice. Sometimes it's a conglomerate of voices all screaming in their own individual suffering. Whatever was trapped in that house has finally reached me. I ran that night. I've been running since. But I'm tired of running. Nicole and James are coming after me, and I can feel their unfiltered drive for revenge, fueled by the colossal hatred of the countless bodies trapped in the amalgamation. Sometimes, as I dream, I can see that wall of skin. It's encompassing the entire world, surrounding me in every direction. Nicole and James's faces are on that architecture of flesh. They're stretched to impossible lengths, staring at me, screaming at me with the anguish of people suffering for an eternity. Hands are reaching toward me, hungrily clawing at the air for their next prey. Just before the fingers graze my face and I wake up, I see what I saw that night at the house just before closing the hatch. A glimpse of a skull-shaped ring digging into the constricted finger. Maybe they're together now, in some kind of twisted unison. Maybe they've become one. Maybe that's the only way for me to be accepted.